702.
World of Work.
So, on our World of Work feature this morning, we're talking about something that, in a way or so, we've all been discouraged by. We're discussing the expectation to have experience before you can land a job, but you can really find a job without having experience. So there are challenges to securing a job without experience. How many of us have been affected by that? I mean, the age-old dilemma of job hunting remains as frustrating as ever. You need experience to land a job, but to gain experience, you need a job. In fact, Stats SA consistently showcases that individuals who have worked before are far more likely to secure a job than those with no prior work history, as noted in studies from 2012, 2024, 2025. So there's a large percentage of unemployed youth, around 58.7% in early 2025, who lack previous work experience, which then makes it a significant barrier to entry. For many young South Africans, landing a job is quite a crucial step towards economic independence and inclusion. And yet, for millions of them, this first step remains out of reach. I mean, I always think about recent graduates and this paradox that I can only imagine, that it feels like an insurmountable barrier, especially when employers place such a high premium on practical experience, because we've all been there at some point. So how can new entrants to the workforce navigate this catch-22 and unlock the door to that elusive first job? Like, how did you, because I want to hear from you as well, how did you make up for your lack of experience when you were looking for a job? I remember when I was already in my second year at university, I went to work for the Pretoria News. It was a newspaper based in Pretoria, as it says. And I worked for the Pretoria News probably ended working there for probably like 2 years. As an intern, I wasn't even getting paid a cent in the beginning. And I think later on, they would probably give me like 200 Rand, I think, for working that week, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember correctly. But the point I'm trying to make is, already by my second year, I tried to go and start getting some experience as an intern, because I realized that when I graduate, the one barrier is going to be, do you have experience when I apply for jobs? How did you do it? Like, how did you make up for your lack of experience when looking for a job? Or were you lucky enough to find a company that said, come through, you'll find the experience here, and become an asset to this company? Give us a call to share your thoughts on 011-883-0702, or you can send your WhatsApp voice notes on 072-702-1702. Nqaba Mabece is an executive for institutional advancement at Rosebank College, who's going to guide us through this conversation. Thank you for making time, Nqaba. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Manyathela. Thank you so much for having me, and that was a very wonderful introduction. Great context there.
It's always quite a paradox, isn't it? It's so complex for us as we just come out of graduation and we're excited. We think life is going to be so cool because after you graduate, you're just going to get a job, until you see what the requirements are for you to get that job. How do people work around that in your experience?
That's a great question, and perhaps it's possibly a recharacterization and reframing that is needed. One should not start to think about employment when they leave tertiary education in the typical route towards that. As soon as one has the ability to contribute with a sense of meaning to society, that's where one starts to build a resume and a portfolio of evidence of what can be broadly characterized as experience. It starts off at volunteering at school and participating in programs that are extracurricular that will give you the kinds of skills, build the necessary characteristics and habits, and form the professional etiquette over time that lends itself to the formal academic training route, if that is the chosen path. And such time that when you get into the professional setup, you are not, if you will, raw and untested in an environment where you take instruction, take initiative, lead projects, and participate with a wide variety and demographic of people. So people ought to understand being a contributor to the economy doesn't necessarily mean it should always be on the exchange of remuneration, but it starts when one can make a contribution to society.
But are we teaching that in secondary up until high school and even during, when you are at university, Nqaba? Because I don't remember anybody talking to me about the need to volunteer. And there have been opportunities for me to do that. I could have done that when I was in high school. Even when I was at university, that wasn't like really a conversation we were having. And I wonder if maybe that's where the lack is we need to start just making it perhaps even part of the curriculum to say to, children that are in high school that find opportunities where you can volunteer or you can be, an intern, learn some skills even at university. Or do you find that that's already being preached, but it's just not being responded to?
That's a great question, and it's an appropriate question. I do think the world in which we are now living is completely and vastly different, if not completely, to the world that I certainly was in when I was a student some 20, 25 years ago. And perhaps the pressures on society now are far greater than they might have been back in my time. So the question really is the curriculum and the system sufficiently adapting and remaining sufficiently agile to be able to respond to the conditions on the ground? That's really a question at both basic education level from a curriculum integration perspective, and especially in the question of tertiary institutions preparing graduates for the real world of work. That's the question, and there are many ways in which that can happen. You mentioned curriculum, adapting curriculum for future demands. Continuously updating course content to include emerging technologies, contemporary industries, practices, ensuring graduates are ready for tomorrow's challenges. Another way one can do that is fostering soft skills, and one probably cannot stress this enough. Embedding critical thinking, communication, problem-solving skills into curricula that helps graduates to prepare for dynamic work environments. Dynamic work environments are the kind that you are in. If I didn't answer this phone, how would you problem solve? Because you have a scheduled appointment, your listeners are anticipating a conversation of this kind. So how would you problem solve if I didn't answer this call? Are there sufficient skills mapping that talk to such questions of how do you problem solve? How do you communicate effectively? Strengthening industry partnerships is crucial. In South Africa, there isn't a shortage of work. And to an extent, everybody has an opportunity to contribute with meaning to South Africa. There has been a cry, and it's not an illegitimate one, that the skills that are being produced by the centers that are creating and producing these skills are not the kind that industry wants. And that really speaks to perhaps a paucity, if that's the word, of industry partnerships, lack of collaboration with employers and employees to align academic programs with market demand, thereby bridging that gap between theory and practice. It's an age-old conversation, but perhaps...
So you think there's a mismatch between what the universities and the colleges are producing and what the employers are actually looking for, like what the labor market is looking for?
I absolutely would imagine that's part of the conversation, probably not exclusively the conversation. There are certain courses now that whilst they are offered, they're not necessarily in high demand or not necessarily going to be the ones that will distinguish you from many other persons with that, because the demands in industry these days perhaps are not consistent with that. And the question has to be, are real work experiences integrated in learning? Are internship programs, apprenticeships, project-based learning to ensure graduates have hands-on experience before entering the world of work? Is that sufficiently catered for in the enterprise of higher education? That's the question that has to be asked. And the best way to answer that is to engage the core and critical stakeholders to that. That would be industry. Are they getting what they want? So there are many ways, as it were, to skin this cat, precisely predicated on the fact that there is no shortage of work in South Africa. Work is not necessarily remunerated, but work that lends itself to community development and, broadly speaking, to society's development and growth.
Yeah. So for some listeners who, because someone was asking, but what do we mean by experience? So for some listeners who want clarity on when an employer says they want experience, what do they really mean? Like, what can that experience look like? So if I have interned somewhere or if I volunteered somewhere, does that count at all? So what advice would you give to parents who are trying to guide their learners into the right direction?
You mentioned something about university, and I was minded to reflect on my own journey. My own journey is not necessarily authoritative in any way, but it perhaps gives one an opportunity to glean into what is possible out there. I was schooled in East London, my high school there, and I went to university down the road at the University of Fort Hare. And because of my close links to my former high school, I always made myself available to be a gap stroke substitute teacher. What that meant was, whenever a teacher, for whatever reason, was not going to be available, I would make sure to meet that teacher, engage in what the following day or that week's lessons were to be, particularly in subjects that I was comfortable in. English, Afrikaans to an extent, and your content subjects like history and geography. I would learn the curriculum for the day or for the week, and then I would make sure I hand out the notes and guide the pupils. By the way, I have passed all those standards at that very school in the preceding 5 years. So that gave me insights into teaching, into time management, into managing groups. I was a coach at that school. I was a fairly decent rugby player, although many might disagree. But I started coaching. I was assigned a team. So you can already tell that whilst one would not say I was working, the fact that I was making myself available to the school on weekends, same thing. With many of these companies who are promoting at the malls, those people who wore domestos pink suits back in the day, I was one of those guys. That was an introduction to sales. I wore blue overalls standing next to pool care equipment. That was me. It paid whatever it paid me at the time, but the greater gain for me was to be exposed to the world of work, sales environment, and in today's language, it might take in the form of internships, learnerships, service programs, volunteer and community-based work. That is all legitimate experience, age and qualification appropriate and contemporary, and it lends itself to distinguishing yourself for the day when you have to make a formal application for a graduate placement program or a candidate attorney or candidate accountant role, as the case may be. These are the things that should be available to everybody precisely because there are many ways of entering the world of work: schools, churches, community-based organizations, care homes, the like. So the opportunities are endless. I'm not suggesting it is always that easy because sometimes one needs to go to these places of work, and with our strained economy, even something that you and I perhaps might take for granted, accessing public transport might not be that simple. Add to that the safety components associated with that, it then becomes, from time to time, from person to person, potentially a bridge too far.
Okay, so before we get to some calls and voice notes, I'm interested in the role that employers can play in creating entry-level opportunities that don't necessarily require prior experience. Like, do you think there's enough incentives for companies to hire first-time job seekers, or or existing incentives? I think there's like the employment tax incentive. Is that working at all?
Look, I think what you really are engaging is how can this shared accountability really look like in reality? What collective responsibility looks like in practice between the core stakeholders being employers that you just mentioned, tertiary institutions, employers and government at large, and the youth. So let me start with the youth. Youth, young people, must take ownership of their employability ultimately by actively seeking exposure, upskilling and building networks rather than waiting for opportunities, shall I say. Because I think if one is sufficiently pressed, they will do what is generally necessary to be able to enter that marketplace. But it does require corresponding obligations and actions elsewhere. Tertiary institutions, government collaborate to co-create even pathways into work, including structured work, integrated learning, funded internships, and clear transition pipelines. That's really the value, especially of your SETAs, your sector education and training authorities. Employers should adopt a development mindset by recognizing potential, which is important, and investing in first-time entrants as part of long-term workforce sustainability. It doesn't matter what skills you have on paper. The reality is when you get into the workplace environment, it will always be new, and it will be new for everybody who's entering that workplace then for the first time.
Yeah. 22 minutes. Yes. So, Nqaba, finish up your point?
No. I think I was done, but I think the most important thing that I really want to emphasize is also for the candidate. I think it's important to always emphasize the unique selling points about an individual. Employers want candidates with field-specific qualities for obvious reasons. So if you're talking about project management, that might be an opportunity for you to say that you pay attention to detail, you are effective in resource management, you are effective in communication, you are effective in stakeholder management. So understanding the key attributes in your field and clearly demonstrate that you've applied these in the past wherever you might have, and communicating your passion that goes with that, passion and enthusiasm. Passion and enthusiasm alone are what employers want. Everything else can be taught, but you cannot teach Clement to be enthusiastic, to be passionate, to be there 2 hours before the broadcast starts because he wants to make sure he is prepared. He wants to make sure that if this guest does not arrive, this is his contingency plan. The stuff that you don't teach will always stand out if it is in somebody who has those attributes, and that's key.
Yeah, let's go to some WhatsApp. So 072-702-1702.
Hi, Clement and the team. My question to your guest is, don't you think that there are certain jobs that require experience, like technical jobs, but certain jobs, Clement, do not require experience because companies define culture? Just imagine someone who've got 10 years working for a company with a different culture. Don't you think that his or her experience become redundant? Thanks, David.
Good morning, Clement. Good morning, 702. I also want help, hey? So I've been in the sales field for quite a long time now, 16, if not 17 years. And I've tried to do a career change, move from sales and go to supply chain. So I've got my higher certificate in supply chain. I've got my degree in Bachelor of Business Administration. So just last year, that's when I did my higher certificate in supply chain. But now I am having trouble to find work without experience. I think this show is going to help me maybe just to know how to navigate, because with my age and my experience, there's no way I'm going to take an intern job. Financially, it's just not doable. So I just want to know, then how do I move from one career to another without affecting my finances, without having any hiccup on the finance side of things. I don't have experience in supply chain. All I have is theory from what I learned. So, please help me with that. Jolene Midrand.
Oh, Jolene, thank you very much. And Nqaba, it feels like from the messages I'm getting on the WhatsApp line, that seems to be a big concern for some listeners listening to this conversation. They've been in one industry for years, and now they want to jump to another industry, but they only have the qualification and no experience. I mean, you don't expect anyone who's over 40 now to go now and quit their job, and now they're starting from scratch. So how do you reconcile that? Is there a way you can deal with that?
There are ways in which that can be dealt with. And now, this is obviously not a conversation about me, but I can't but not engage my own experiences. I was doing articles in Cape Town circa 2010, 2011, and I'd always had the passion for broadcast, for instance. And so I walked over to a local broadcast hub. You would know it very well, 567 Cape Talk, and I said I wanted to participate in what this station's product is, and that's getting the conversation out there. At some point, the sacrifice has to be made, because if you want something bad enough, you will do what it takes to get it. And I started off doing the graveyard shift. Imagine doing a full shift Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and then doing the graveyard shift of midnight to 4 a.m. If that's what I wanted, that's what I did. Not to be flippant on it. So let me come back to the second voice note, which talks about being in sales and wanting to pivot into supply chain. For instance, what informs the purchase? So when you go to a client and they buy something, what informs that purchase? There are already links between sales and supply chain. It's then just a question of engaging the person who buys your product and asking him or her what informs the purchase, what R&D they do, and how to that extent it fits into what they do from a sales perspective. The life cycle of a product, that's all about supply chain. It tells you more about the product that you are selling, but it also tells you how frequently perhaps your product might be in demand. It helps you better understand your sales frequency, and with that you can make the slight pivot towards the supply chain environment precisely because you know who your competitors are, so you would know where to start looking if you were in supply chain as opposed to where you are from sales, using your sales experiences. So have a conversation with somebody who typically buys your product. Go to the conferences that speak to supply chain. Supply chain in many ways is public procurement or procurement in the broad sense. Your qualifications, business administration, higher certificate in supply chain, these all lend themselves to supply chain. And the fact that you've got a sales experience, I wouldn't think you are at such a great disadvantage, if at all, from somebody who wants to enter the supply chain because that's where he or she started off and that's where his or her passion is. You are a contemporary in that space, just a different stakeholder, and now you are remodeling yourself as somebody who's going to be in the core supply chain. That's what I would say to you. So obviously, we would need more time for me to engage what it is that she really does and when in supply chain she wants to go to, because there are many components to supply chain. It's not just one static place. The supply chain could also involve logistics at a particular point in time. And then again, you have to ask the question, how does your product get from your floor to that of your client? And how can you assist in that? How could you make it more efficient and more seamless? That then starts engaging that person, and that's all about supply chain. So she should not think she is not in supply chain just because her title says she is in sales.
Yeah. And then I'll wrap up with this message from Anonymous who says, Clement, I applied for an administrator learnership and was successful. I quit a paying retail job. When it was time to do practicals, I volunteered at a company that dealt with administration. Soon after the learnership, I got the administration job in a reputable laboratory. Thank you, Anonymous, for sharing that experience with us. Nqaba Mabece, thank you for joining us for this chat. He's an executive for institutional advancement at Rosebank College.